The dart hit Ambassador Yellow Cross in the throat while she was still smiling. She had to be mid-sentence, actually. Something about trade manifests and the third clause of the Arathon Accords. And then the smile stopped, and her hand went up to her neck, and she pulled the thing out and looked at it the way you look at a splinter. A small confusion and inconvenience. Petty Officer Dara Nkosi saw it happen from 12 meters away, at the edge of the reception corridor where she was stationed with a sidearm she'd never expected to draw. She crossed the distance before anyone else had processed what they were seeing. The ambassador's knees were already going. Nkosi caught her. The dart was 3 centimeters of dark composite, tapered at both ends, no markings. It smelled like wet copper and something else she couldn't name. Something that made her sinuses prick the way they did before a storm. She didn't drop it. She probably should have. Within 4 hours, 16 people in Outpost Meridian had a fever. Within 8, they were bleeding from their eyes. The outpost was a colonial resupply station hollowed into the ice shelf of Kepler's second moon. 1,400 people, mostly civilian, families of the mining crews that worked the methane veins 200 kilometers south. It had 3 medical bays, 2 quarantine cells rated for biological containment, and 1 xenobiologist. That was Dr. Marin Okeke. She'd been on Kepler-7's moon for 11 months, studying the respiratory adaptations of a species of cave shrimp that had evolved to breathe ammonia. She was, by her own frequent admission, not a virologist. She was not an epidemiologist. She had not signed up to be the last line of defense between 1,400 people and a pathogen she'd never seen. None of that stopped her from suiting up. She had the ambassador moved to Medical Bay 1 and isolated behind the rated containment seal before the station commander, a Major Holland, had even reached the medical wing. Holland arrived with 3 of his security people and the expression of someone who had already decided on a course of action. "We need to vent the wing," he said. Marin was pulling on her second glove. "We need to identify the pathogen. If this thing gets into the ventilation system, it's already in the ventilation system." She looked at him over her shoulder. 16 people, Major. It started 8 hours ago. It's been in the air since before anyone knew there was an air to worry about. Holland's jaw moved. He was not a bad man. She'd decided in the 11 months she'd worked adjacent to his command. He was just a man who'd been trained to solve problems by elimination, and right now the math of elimination was very loud in his head. "The Arathon fleet is 3 hours out," he said. She stopped. Turned around fully. "They're the ones who did this," he said. "They hit the ambassador with a bioweapon, and now they're coming to watch what happens. Command has been informed. If we can't contain this," he stopped, cleared his throat. "If we can't demonstrate containment in 72 hours, Command will authorize an orbital strike on the outpost." The room was very quiet. 72 hours, she said, to prevent spread to the primary colony. She looked at the ambassador through the containment glass. Yellow Cross was conscious, barely. She had her hand pressed flat against the window, fingers splayed, like she was trying to feel the temperature of a thing on the other side. "Then I'd better get started," Marin said. The Arathon were not a species she knew well. Nobody did, really. They were a contact class 4 civilization, which meant they'd been aware of humanity for about 60 years and had spent 59 of those years pretending they hadn't noticed. They communicated through a dense system of chemical signal and subharmonic vibration. They had 4 manipulator limbs, no visible eyes in the human sense, just a band of photoreceptive tissue that ran around the cranial dome like a crown. They were roughly the size of a large horse, bilateral, and when they moved in atmosphere, they made a sound like a bow being drawn slowly across a very long string. 3 Arathon delegates had been on Meridian for the trade talks. They'd been escorted back to their shuttle before anyone had thought to stop them. Marin found the footage at hour 9. The dart had come from the largest delegate, a motion so small and so fast that the station's cameras had almost missed it. A flick of the secondary manipulator while the primary was extended for the ceremonial contact gesture. You had to know what you were looking for. She wasn't sure she would have caught it if she hadn't been watching the ambassador's face in that exact half-second, trying to understand the specific quality of the smile. She isolated the dart in a sealed specimen tray and ran the first analysis at hour 10. The pathogen wasn't a virus, it wasn't a bacterium. It was something she didn't have a clean word for, a self-replicating protein complex that behaved like a prion but reproduced like a retrovirus and targeted respiratory epithelium with a specificity that suggested it had been designed. It was not a natural thing, it had been built. The cascade was elegant, the way that terrible things can be elegant when you're looking at them from far enough away. The protein bound to cilia. The cilia died. The immune response tried to compensate by flooding the area with inflammatory agents, which the protein also bound to and replicated through. The lungs drowned themselves in their own defenses. At hour 12, the ambassador stopped breathing on her own. Marin intubated her herself. At hour 14, they lost the first patient. A cargo handler named Teodoro Vasques, 41, father of 2. He'd been in the corridor nearest the reception hall when the dart fired. He'd been one of the 16. Marin stood outside the room where he'd died and looked at her hands inside their gloves and thought about the specific shape of the problem. The pathogen was designed. That meant it had been designed with an off switch, something that would let the Arathan deploy it without risk to themselves. Every weapon had a safety. You didn't build a bioweapon and then breathe it yourself. She went back to the footage. She watched the Arathan delegates move through the reception corridor for 2 hours. She watched the way they didn't touch the finger food displays, the way they angled their photoreceptive bands away from the ventilation grills. Small things, deliberate things. She watched the largest delegate, the one who'd fired. She watched the way its secondary manipulators stayed close to its body after. The way it touched, twice, a nodule at the base of its cranial dome. At hour 17, Nkosi knocked on the lab door. Marin almost didn't let her in. The petty officer had been in the room when the dart fired, had been in contact with the ambassador, had potentially breathed whatever had been in the air in that first terrible dispersal. But she was not sick. 14 hours in, and her temperature was normal, her lungs were clear, and she was standing in the corridor with the dart still in a sealed pouch on her belt, because nobody had thought to take it from her, and she hadn't thought to give it up. "You're not sick," Marin said through the intercom. "No, ma'am, you were the closest one." "Yes, ma'am." Marin looked at the dart in its sealed bag. "Come in." Nkosi's blood work took 40 minutes to process. Marin ran it twice. Then she ran it a third time with a different protocol, and when the third result came back the same, she sat down on a crate of ammonia-resistant specimen jars and put her face in her hands and stayed that way for a while. Then she got up and got back to work. The pathogen needed a specific surface protein to bind. Most humans had it. The receptor was common, almost universal, expressed on the respiratory epithelium of about 98% of the human population, but Nkosi was in the 2%. A genetic variant, rare but not unknown, that slightly altered the conformation of the cilia binding site. The protein couldn't grip, it slid off. She was a natural immune. The antibodies in her blood were not. They were completely naive to the pathogen, as expected. But her cells had something else. The alteration that prevented binding also, it seemed, produced a secondary metabolite. Marin isolated it at hour 19. It was small, simple, and it disrupted the protein's replication cycle at the binding stage. It was not a cure. Not yet. It was a component, a lock that needed a key. The key was in the Arathan. She went back to the footage, the nodule. The touch, twice deliberate, at the base of the cranial dome. She ran the Arathan biological database, sparse, incomplete, assembled from 60 years of reluctant contact, and found a reference to cranial glandular structures in Arathan physiology. Vestigial, the notation said. Possibly exocrine, possibly exocrine. Exocrine glands secreted outward into the environment to signal. The Arathan fleet was 90 minutes out when she called Major Holland. "I need a shuttle," she said, "and I need Nkosi." Holland looked like he'd aged since she'd last seen him. He probably had. "The fleet is 90 minutes, I know. I need 50. Doctor, if you go out there, If I don't go out there, you get to explain to 1,400 families why you let command burn them. She held his stare through the screen. I'm not asking you to come. I'm not asking you to authorize anything on paper. I'm asking you to look the other way for 50 minutes. He looked away, which was the same thing. The shuttle was a 6-seat runabout, the kind used for surface-to-orbit cargo transfers. It had a docking clamp rated for Arathan hull interfaces. All colonial outposts in contact zones were required to carry them, a stipulation of the Accords nobody had ever expected to use in an emergency. Nkosi flew. Marin sat in the co-seat and worked on a portable sequencer the size of a shoebox, trying to synthesize enough of the inhibitor compound from Nkosi's blood to matter. They'll see us coming, Nkosi said. Yes, they might not let us dock. They might, and if they shoot us instead. Marin looked up from the sequencer. Then at least we tried. Nkosi was quiet for a moment. She was 26 years old, and she flew with the easy certainty of someone who'd been doing it since she was old enough to reach the controls. She had a small scar over her left eyebrow from an incident she'd never explained. She looked, Marin thought, like someone who had already decided this was the kind of situation she'd signed up for, even if she hadn't known it at the time. What's the play when we dock? Nkosi said. We need a sample. From the cranial nodule of the delegate who fired the dart, you want to walk up to the alien that just committed an act of war and ask it to donate blood. I want to walk up to it and take what I need before it understands what's happening. Nkosi glanced at her. You know they won't let us leave after. They'll let us leave if we can show them we can do something they can't. She went back to the sequencer. The inhibitor compound was coming together. Not fast, not in any quantity that would matter on its own, but enough to demonstrate the principle, enough to show what it could do. The Arathan flagship was large, that was the word for it, large in the way that geography is large, in the way that weather systems are large. It hung in the dark between Meridian and the primary colony like a decision someone hadn't announced yet. They hailed it on the Arathan contact frequency. The response was 30 seconds of subharmonic sound that the translator rendered as, approach is noted. Approach is categorized. Is that a yes? Nkosi said. I think it's a we're watching you, Marin said. Good enough. The docking was rough, the clamp interface was rated for Arathan hulls, but not for Arathan hulls that weren't cooperating, and the flagship wasn't cooperating, and so Nkosi put the clamp on the hull, manually, in a maneuver that involved language Marin chose not to comment on. The seal held. The airlock cycled. 3 Arathan met them in the connector corridor. They were enormous in person. The holo images and the contact footage hadn't prepared Marin for the specific quality of their presence. The way the photoreceptive band tracked everything at once, the subharmonic vibration she felt in her sternum, rather than heard with her ears the smell of them. Ozone and something sweet and fermented, like overripe fruit left in electrical equipment. The largest one, she was certain, from the footage that this was the same delegate, extended its primary manipulator in the contact gesture of the Accords, the ceremonial opening. The pretense of civility, Marin extended her hand, made contact. And while the gesture was happening, while every photoreceptive cell in the band was focused on the ritual of it, Nkosi stepped to the delegate's right flank. Her motion was quiet and precise and deliberate. She'd been briefed on the nodule location. The sample collection needle was a medical tool, not a weapon. Small, fast. The delegate registered it as something, a sensation, a surprise, and the subharmonic shifted to something that might have been alarm. But the sample was already in the collection tube, and Nkosi was already stepping back, hands where they could be seen, expression perfectly neutral. There was a moment, a long, suspended moment, where Marin was certain they were about to die. The delegate's secondary manipulators came up, the other 2 Arathan shifted. The vibration in the corridor changed frequency in a way the translator couldn't pass, but that Marin's hindbrain understood instinctively as danger. She held up the sequencer. We have the compound, she said. The inhibitor, we synthesized it. We know what it does, and we know how it works. And we can demonstrate that right here. The translator rendered this in subharmonic. She'd loaded the Arathon interface module from the Outpost communications archive. She wasn't sure how good the rendering was. She wasn't sure it mattered. She was betting on something else. She was betting that whoever had built this weapon was smart enough to know that if a human was standing in front of them, holding a solution, it meant the weapon hadn't worked. The photoreceptor watched her. The vibration shifted again, lower, slower, a frequency that the translator finally caught up to and rendered imperfectly as explain. So she explained. She was a scientist. She had been awake for 20 hours. She was standing in the corridor of an alien warship with no weapons and no authority and 1,400 people behind her on a countdown, and she explained the mechanism of their own weapon to them in clear, careful terms. She told them what the protein did. She told them what Nkosi's variant prevented. She told them what the secondary metabolite could do to the replication cycle, and she showed them on the sequencer's display screen because the translator wasn't good enough for the chemistry, but the display was. She would think later, furious the entire time. Not visibly, not in any way she let into her voice or her hands. But underneath, very quiet and very steady, she was more angry than she had ever been in her life, because they'd built this thing. They'd built it and aimed it at a room full of people who'd come to talk, and they'd thought it would just work neat and complete, and nobody would have the audacity to get on a shuttle and come ask for the receipts. The largest delegate was still for a very long time. Then it touched the nodule at the base of its cranial dome. It was a deliberate gesture, a chosen one. It pressed 2 manipulators against the nodule and held them there, and the exocrine secretion that followed was visible even through the Arathon's surface integument. A slight darkening, a shift in the ozone and sweetness smell. "Is that?" Nkosi started. "Yes," Marin said. She was already moving with the second collection tube. The return trip took 22 minutes. Marin worked on the sequencer the entire way. Nkosi flew with one on the instruments and one eye on the countdown she'd put in the corner of the display, the one labeled Command Authorization, ticking towards 0 in red. They had 6 minutes when the shuttle docked. Marin ran from the landing bay. She had never run that fast in her life. She had the synthesis complete in her head. She'd been running the steps in her mind for the entire flight, checking and rechecking, knowing she would have one chance and no margin. She hit the medical lab at a sprint, slapped the synthesis console to life, and started feeding it inputs. Holland was at the lab door. He said something. She didn't hear it. She was watching the synthesis chamber and counting seconds. The compound came out at 4 minutes 40. She had it in the dispersal system at 4 minutes 55. The station's air system pushed it through every vent, every corridor, every sealed room, in a wave she couldn't see and couldn't feel but knew was moving. She stood in the middle of the medical bay and watched the clock and breathed the air and didn't know yet if it would work. At 3 minutes, Ambassador Cross's oxygen saturation ticked up 1 point. At 2 minutes, it ticked up 3 more. At 90 seconds, with command's window still open, with Holland's hand still on the communications panel, with the question of 1,400 lives still waiting for an answer, the ambassador opened her eyes. They were bloodshot. She looked terrible. She looked like someone who had been to a very dark place and had found, at the far edge of it, a door that wasn't locked. She looked at Marin through the containment glass and didn't say anything. She just put her hand flat against the window. Fingers splayed. The same gesture she'd made 8 hours ago in the same glass from the other side. Marin put her hand up to meet it. They stayed like that while Holland talked command down from the strike, while the countdown went to 0 and then past it and nothing burned. While somewhere outside, on the hull of a ship too large to be called a ship, the Arathon fleet held its position and processed the information that their weapon had a counter, which meant that humanity could already build the counter, which meant that the calculus of using the weapon had just changed entirely. Nkosi found her an hour later in the specimen storage room, sitting on the same crate of ammonia-resistant jars. She had a flask. She sat down next to Marin and passed it over without comment. The drink was something from the southern continent of Mars, grain-based, with a finish like burnt caramel and regret. Marin drank enough to feel it and passed the flask back. "How many?" she said. "3," Nkosi said. "Teodoro Vasquez, a woman from engineering, Cerisa Bautista, and one of the ambassador's staff. 3 out of 1,400. 3 people who died in the hours before the inhibitor, before the sample, before the flight and the furious explanation in the connector corridor." She didn't say anything for a while. "You know what gets me," Nkosi said. She turned the flask in her hands. "They built it to be invisible. The whole thing, the dart, the cascade, the timeline. They built it so that by the time anyone understood what was happening, it would already be over. They didn't think anyone would have time to be curious." "They were wrong about that," Marin said. "Yeah." Nkosi took a pull from the flask. "What happens now, with the fleet?" "I don't know, that's above my pay grade." Marin looked at her hands. "I assume there will be talks. Different kinds than the ones we were having. With the ambassador, if she recovers enough, or with someone else." She paused. "They gave us the sample. In the end, that was a choice. You backed them into it. I gave them information and waited to see what they'd do with it." She thought about the photoreceptive band, watching. The pause before the deliberate press of manipulators to nodule. Something in that room decided it was better to let us leave than not. "Doesn't make it okay," Nkosi said. "What they did, no." Marin agreed with that completely and without qualification. "No, it doesn't." They sat in the storage room for a while longer, passing the flask back and forth, while outside the containment bays the air cyclers ran the compound through the station for the 3rd time, and the fever charts in the medical bay started moving in the right direction, and somewhere in the dark beyond the ice shelf, a fleet large enough to make geography feel small was deciding what it had learned today. What it had learned was this: humans given 72 hours and a portable sequencer and a petty officer with an unusual genetic variant would reverse engineer your bioweapon. They would get on a shuttle with no weapons and no backup. They would dock with your flagship by force and ask you to your face for what they needed. They would run the synthesis in 4 minutes 55 seconds and push it through 1,400 people's air supply and still have 5 seconds on the clock. They would do this not because they were fearless, but because they were stubborn, because they kept getting curious at the worst possible moments, because somewhere in the long, complicated, often stupid history of what humans were, they had developed a specific allergy to giving up that even the cleverest weapon couldn't account for. The flask went empty somewhere around the 5th pass, and Nkosi held it upside down over her palm and watched the last drop fall. "I still have the dart," she said. "Nobody ever asked for it back." "Keep it," Marin said. "Why?" Marin looked at the containment glass. The ambassador was sleeping now, really sleeping, her chest rising and falling with the unassisted rhythm of someone who had decided to stay. The displays above her were full of numbers that were moving in the right direction for the first time in a very long day. "Because the next time someone tells you that you don't have the training for a thing," Marin said, "you can show them what you used to solve it." Nkosi looked at the dart in its sealed bag, considered it. Then she tucked it into her breast pocket, over her heart. Outside, the fleet held its position. The sun of Kepler-7 was rising over the ice shelf, slow and red, painting the hull of the station in colors that looked, from far enough away, almost warm.